All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And it's very exciting to be here today with Gabe Oatley from Future of Good. I'm a big Future of Good fan, and I've been a paying subscriber for a couple of years now. And it's actually it's encouraging to see that kind of journalism being done, focusing on the sector in Canada, because there has not been a lot over the years typically, and I think it was a really big gap that Future of Good's filling, and also around the international cooperation issues, both of which I'm very passionate about. So great, and great to actually have a chance to meet you and speak to you today. Just very briefly, so my name is Jessie. I'm the founder and CEO of Jan Clark Consulting, and our mission is to empower nonprofits to be more effective in their work with government, whether that's through getting funding or through advocacy and policy engagement. And so the topic we're going to be talking about today is very near and dear to my heart, and also very, very core to the mission of Jan Clark Consulting. And it's a topic that's, that won't go away, I think, in Canada. It's been around for many years. I think charities and nonprofits, have had many different situations and many different kinds of charities and nonprofits over the years where they felt concerned that they're running afoul of some, particular political direction, or where they felt reluctant to really engage in advocacy, campaigning, making political change, because they're concerned that it might impact their funding. And of course, as we know, the sector in Canada, especially, I would say community service organizations, international cooperation organizations, a lot of, some of the more kind of organizations that focus on really specific community groups, a lot of those organizations have a lot of government funding and are really dependent on it. And so I wanted to turn over now to Gabe, both to introduce himself and also to tell us a little bit about the work that he's been doing recently. Future of Good put out an article a few weeks ago citing some examples, some very troubling, in my view, examples of the Trillium Foundation basically putting in restrictions within their funding agreements to prevent recipients from undertaking advocacy activities. So anyway, Gabe, I want to turn over to you.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Jessie. Appreciate the intro and the chance to be here and chat about this topic and this story. My name's Gabe. I'm a reporter with Future of Good. My pronouns are he or they. This story we published, I don't know, about a week and a half now. And I think there were like two key headlines of it. The first was, indeed, that the foundation made changes to several of their policies, specifically their eligibility policy, their advocacy policy, and their grant contract language around advocacy that had the effect of shutting down either charities who applied to OTF from getting money because of OTF's interpretation that those charities had violated their new advocacy policy, or that had the effect of shutting down advocacy that charities wanted to undertake, but they were OTF funded and worried that they would be in violation of the policy. And I think the second big finding is that those changes were made at a time when OTF's board it had a leader, a chair of the board, who is a longtime conservative insider, is the current president of the PC Party of Ontario. And there were 4 other folks on the board at that time who have very tight links to the Ontario PC Party. And, we obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, a briefing note, which very clearly said that one of the things that the board was considering at the time when they were making those changes to that policy was that advocacy that charities who OTF may fund, advocacy that they could undertake may be sort of at direct odds with the policy direction of the Ford government. And so I think the folks we spoke to the charities we spoke to who were affected by this policy were pretty understandably alarmed by the fact that, it so clearly appeared that partisanship and sort of concern about the conservative government's political interests were motivating changes to, OTFs, policies that ultimately restricted their capacity to engage in issues that affect the lives of Ontarians every day: childcare stuff, environmental stuff, etc. So those were some of the biggies. I'm happy to go into further detail, but I also just want to name that we super welcome folks to share any questions or comments you have in the chat, and we'd be happy to get to those as well.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Gabe. Yeah, and if anyone has experiences or any specific examples or questions they want to share, or if you want to be more general as well, because I know that people may not always want to identify themselves when talking about a topic like this, for sure. No, thank you for that summary, and I think it's a return. It's an ongoing trend that we've seen, right? So I think from my perspective, because I've been in this sector and doing this work for more than 20 years, I recall very acutely at the time when the federal government through the CRA was perceived to be at least going after certain organizations that were seen to be conducting advocacy, but specifically advocacy that maybe opposed some of the partisan political views of that particular leadership. Mm-hmm. And again, I mean, it's hard to know. We don't know all of the decisions, how everything was made, how every decision was made. We have some information, like what you've been able to obtain, for example. And I want to say too, like this is not a partisan issue per se, right? I mean, there's obviously trends that we observe in terms of governments that are in power at various times. Mm-hmm. But I think it's a concern overall for the sector in Canada. Mm-hmm. And I think there've been many different examples where I think one of the things that I find difficult and frustrating as somebody who does this kind of work is that I really firmly believe that the nonprofit sector has a very critical role to play in Canada's democracy. And I think a lot of people in government believe that as well, that they really want to know, they want the perspectives that nonprofits can bring to the table. Right. They want nonprofits' direct relationship with communities. They want their perspective on specific issues where they're more experts and have more technical expertise maybe than government. Yeah. So they really welcome that kind of engagement. Yeah. And I think it's very important for the nonprofit sector to continue to provide that kind of engagement, and also to speak up on behalf of their communities to try and make change when there's policy directions that very clearly impact on their ability to achieve their charitable objective as per the CRA. Yeah. And so it's concerning that when we hear about this kind of thing. And I think there was another recent example from Vancouver, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe you can speak to that as well, Gabe. I don't know.
Yeah, sure. This is one that caught my eye as well. It was in March. The city of Vancouver passed a motion requiring an amendment that asked staff to come up with sort of new granting rules to communicate clearly that organizations who would be eligible to access city funds must comply with the city's respectful communication policy. And one of the examples that was cited council was a nonprofit in the city who had, I believe the executive director had made a comment about the leadership of, who had been elected, the new mayor, and sort of to what degree it was anticipated that he would sort of support communities in the city that needed support. And folks I saw, commenting on that discussion in council expressed a lot of concern that it would have a sort of similar impact as the concerns that folks were noting about Trillium, just that it would chill advocacy, chill communication. And I mean, to your point, Jesse, around the role that many folks believe nonprofits and charities should be playing in advocacy. In this OTF story, we spoke with the chair of a board of an environmental conservation organization, guy by the name of John Good, and he said something very similar. He was like, I don't think that Ontarians believe that their tax dollars that are flowing to OTF should be used as a tool to muzzle charities from engaging in essential public policy debate. He was like, public servants, bureaucrats should want to hear from the vast network of social service organizations operating across the province, because they're the ones who are talking to people every day about the challenges that they're facing and the impact of public policy decisions. Like, we have a vital role to play in sharing this information, and to use tax dollars, funneling through OTF as a vehicle to sort of defang that kind of advocacy and that kind of civil society engagement. His perspective was that Ontarians do not want that to happen and don't understand or expect that to be happening.
Yeah, no, you're that's an interesting point too, I think, around, public perception of charities and their role in Canada. And I think you're right in that most people wouldn't even think twice, I think, about the fact that it is part of a nonprofit or charity's role to engage in policy discussions and debates, and to raise public awareness on issues. I don't think that would, for most members of the public, I don't think that would be a concern. I think that one of the things that I've spent a lot of time talking to organizations about and kind of working on with the sector is that, in terms of this, there's CRA guidance that exists on this area, right? And so the CRA guidance that exists is I think often different than what people maybe think it is, and where they've tried to make it as clear as possible. I mean, I think there's always a lot of nuance because partisan issues, and this is where one of these areas where I think it gets so complicated, because you might have a very strong opinion on an issue that affects your charity directly. And that may happen to align with partisan positions as well, right? And so it's inevitable there's going to be some overlap. Totally. I think the CRA guidance that's been helpful for me in my work, and that I've tried to convey to others as well, is that so long as you're not embarking in partisan political activity, if you're embarking in issues-based advocacy that's focused on the issues that you're working on as a charity, you should be on very safe ground.
Right.
That's what the Charities Directorate has said. That's what's been echoed by many others who follow these issues as well. But we can try and send that message out, and then things like this happen, right? And and of course, this isn't, we're talking about a provincial institution. We're not talking about CRA is a federal institution. We're not talking about charitable status being revoked. That's a different discussion. But it's the fact that they're very directly tying, the fact that they want people can only receive funding if they're willing to sign on to this kind of guidance.
Right.
I think is very concerning.
Yeah, I mean, OTF was clear with me in a response to an email I sent that the policy, like the contract wording that had said that charities who got funding could not engage in any advocacy, they said that effectively was a mistake, and that there were several words missing in the policy, and that they would update the contract to be clearer, to align with what is listed on the eligibility policy on their website. And it seems clear to me that they have done that. I think it's also important to note that my research did not find that every charity that has interacted with OTF since 2020 has experienced a vast chill. That was really not the case. I talked to some who said, no, I haven't heard anything about this, including those who engage in advocacy. And so I think it is really important to keep in perspective, like, how significant the chill is and how significant it isn't, because I think even a story like this could contribute to a chill that happens across the province. And it is the case that OTF said to me that they believe that advocacy is an important part of the way that some organizations achieve their mission. So, I take that at face value. I think it's also the case that there are some private funders who are increasingly leaning into supporting advocacy believing that it is, an absolutely essential way that they can achieve the impact that the foundation wants to see in the world. In some cases, the only way that they can achieve the scale of the impact that they want to see. For instance, we just did a story a couple months back about the Trottier Foundation, which decided to sort of lean into supporting more advocacy activities after having put some money in to support some significant climate mobilizations in Montreal a couple of years back. So there are organizations that are sort of leaning into this, seeing it as important. And it is not the case that like every organization who's interacted with OTF has been deeply defanged or anything of the kind. It is the case that some have. And I think what folks said to me was like, any indication that a funder, especially a funder with a heck of a lot of money, any indication that they aren't keen on you engaging in advocacy is a big deal. Boards are by nature risk-averse institutions. They're also institutions that are, meeting, say, once a month to consider a whole host of activities. And so an issue like this is complex, and sometimes boards will say, to hell with it, this is too stressful. Let's leave this to one of the other big advocacy organizations. Let's leave this to Imagine Canada, or let's leave this to somebody else. And fundamentally, what I heard from folks was like that weakens advocacy across the sector. Like more voices are actually important for changing public perception and narratives about an issue and influencing the direction that that politicians take on an issue. It's like, it's intuitive that if you hear something from one organization, it's not going to be as powerful as if you hear it from 50. It's like pretty basic.
And that's actually advice that I've given organizations, a number of times over the years, is that, if you can put yourself into, quote unquote, good company, and join your advocacy efforts with other organizations with similar objectives, it helps manage that perceived risk, right? And I think on the part of boards and other leadership, that you wouldn't be singled out. Then you can be contributing your voice to a number of voices on a particular issue of interest. Yeah. And that can also often be more powerful in terms of the impact of the kind of change you're trying to make as well. I wanted to take a look here because we see a question here from Kate Cornell. Thank you for your question. How can we get charities to listen to this? The clarity. Yeah, that's kind of something that I've done ambition to do personally, but my platform is not really very big. Imagine Canada has also honestly done a lot of fantastic work in this area over the years in really trying to encourage organizations to speak out. And I think, I think there's also, particular subsectors of the nonprofit and charity sector that maybe have more or less constraints as well. And I think, it's very interesting. Something I've been spending a lot of time lately talking about is about the principles of community-centered fundraising and how they might apply to government funding and government fundraising. Because I think there's been, by necessity, there's limited funding in Canada, and so there's been an environment of competition that's been created among a lot of charities for government funding. And because of that, I think that can really feed into this whole chill where, well, we don't want to be the one organization that's getting in trouble for this or having our wrist slapped or putting a foot out of line, because we don't want our funding to be jeopardized. But I think if we're able to really lean into some of those principles around, we can actually collaborate as a sector and really focus on what our collective impact is and how can we support and uplift other organizations' priorities as well. I think that's one way, to somewhat work against this kind of thing. But I don't want to be a Pollyanna. Like I've worked for a number of different organizations. I've been advising leadership on policy and advocacy efforts. And it is difficult for sure, because of the risk aversion, I think, Gabe, that you were describing. And I think you're right that there's a risk too, and that we don't want to reinforce the perception that people shouldn't be engaging this kind of thing. Because I actually think not only is it, a cornerstone of our democracy to have civil society be engaged, right? I think it's also and I think really as well a moral obligation of charities and nonprofits. But I think more than that, I think it's also a way to make sure that your work is impactful over the long term and sustainable.
Yeah, no, totally. I think two things come to mind for me around that. Great question, Kate. The first is, I think it's really important that folks in the civil society sector understand the history around how change happens. I know that for myself personally, this is like history I've had to learn over time. How did we get major labor labor rights that we benefit from every day? The 5-day work week, the 40-hour work week, parental rights. All of those things are labor movement victories. The same can certainly be said of victories around childcare, etc. I think as I sort of came into the charitable sector at a time when social enterprise was all the rage, and I think my starting understanding was that we will get big change by innovating our way there, by coming up with a business model that we've never thought of before. And certainly I still believe that business model innovation has a role to play in bringing about change that's important. But increasingly I've come to understand that, I think big societal level systemic change comes from changes to policy. Changes to policy come from social movement victories that can certainly involve the nonprofit sector. So I don't know. I think there's a really important role to play in helping the sector understand that history and lifting up big victories and celebrating those big victories. And unsurprisingly, as a journalist, I'm going to say I think storytelling does have a role to play in really celebrating those victories when they do happen, and sort of highlighting the role that civil society organizations and social movement organizations have played in achieving those victories. Pretty easily, I think they can get spun as government victories when good policy change happens, and certainly celebrate the government for doing good things. But also, governments don't tend to do things alone or just because they liked the idea. They tend to do things because they've gotten a lot of heat for not doing that thing, or they feel that it is a thing that a huge part of their constituency cares about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, it's the space that we're in. And if you look back, there's so many interesting examples that can come to mind where, and it's funny. I think there's a way that I know that in my career too, I've sometimes tried to talk about advocacy in a way that's more palatable by calling it policy engagement or policy input, or trying to kind of damp down what seems a bit scary about it for leaders and boards within organizations. But I mean, I think also it's a spectrum, and all elements of it are really important in terms of sometimes you need to have voices that are pushing very hard and very critical of what's happening in government. So that because that's an important accountability function, right? Yeah. You want to always, in my perspective, in any case, you want to always have somebody who's saying, well, you're not going far enough, or somebody who's saying you've gone too far. I mean, that's a space that a lot of governments want to try and occupy. I think is being somewhere in the middle, where you're still being effective and making change. And there's lots of examples. And when I think about, briefly, because I've worked in the international cooperation sector a lot, I think when you look at all the different G7 summits over the years, most recently, Charlevoix, there was a big push around getting further investment in education. In that sector, I think sometimes it's be a bit more obvious or transparent how there's this relationship between organizations coming together and, advocating for a particular issue, for investment in a particular issue, and then turning around and getting benefit from it, which is, I think, to my mind, it's great when that works well. And then organizations can then ideally take lessons they learn from implementing that work and use it to advocate further. That to me is a healthy functioning democracy, really, where the sectors are engaged and is bringing perspectives that you just can't get when you're, and I've been a civil servant for 10 years of my career as well. So, it's harder to get access to those perspectives when you're inside that bubble, right?
Totally. Totally.
But I think there's also a place for, much more outspoken advocacy, maybe that's calling on your membership to mobilize on a particular issue. And I think it's important that people understand that even if it's an issue that may have, some echoes of partisanship, so long as it's not that you're saying, don't vote for this particular party, right, or we're not going to invite them to this particular event. I mean, you do have a fair amount of latitude. And I would also say that, again, too, like the majority of times, that engagement is really welcomed by government. I think to a very large degree. I think that, it's good if you have strong relationships with government as well. You're going to be in a better position to have, nuanced conversations where you can both be pushing and also be responding to them, and be attuned to what, what's helping them move things along, because sometimes that can be very, very helpful as well.
Totally.
It's an interesting, a challenging situation, and I don't know, from if you have a sense from the organizations in your article, like what has been the impact so far? Have they had to change what they're doing? Are they, planning to refocus in any way?
Yeah, a good question. I just want to, I'll answer that. I just want to follow up on something you were just saying there, which is just, I think for another article I'm writing, I've heard from somebody who is, in government who just said that, like, their experience is that businesses get in touch with them very frequently, but it is very rare, actually, that nonprofits and charities get in touch with them, and that they would really welcome more conversations. And, that to me seems like the lowest stakes kind of engagement. You're not tweeting out anything that is going to catch anybody's eye or what have you. You're directly getting in contact with the person who is, responsible for making the policy change. And so that's maybe an area for nonprofits and charities to think about also. I think the charities I spoke to for this piece were concerned, like the example of the environmental conservation charity. They, for instance, didn't sign a petition around the Greenbelt. You could say, oh, what's the big deal? One organization didn't sign one petition, fair enough. But I think the real concern is that there were other organizations who were making, similar judgment calls and not signing other petitions, not making other statements. And I think for Compass, Early Learning and Care, the organization that was deemed ineligible for funding, I think their feeling is really that, that they are probably not going to continue to be eligible for OTF funding, and that feels like a really significant challenge. They said, like, most of their money, they are provincially funded, most of their funds to support the childcare centers in their network come from the province. And they said there really aren't that many other childcare funders across the country to fund kind of like innovative other projects. And that was really what they applied for support to OTF for. So that feels like a big deal for them.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And it's not like there's a wide variety of provincial funding sources in Ontario. I mean, OTF is pretty, it plays a very important role. So it's understandable. Yeah. I think the organizations would feel that way. I just want to pick up on another comment as well, in terms of, the charities are not only allowed to do advocacy work, they have an obligation to do so, which is, obviously echoing my sentiments, but I think this is a really good example they're sharing. The Canadian Cancer Society, Lung Association were active in, pushing for tobacco restrictions, and that part of prevention is essential. And I mean, look at the impact that's had. That specific example. Totally. If I think back 15 years ago when I began my working life, and they were still smoking allowed even in offices, I think so. It's it's kind of remarkable to think about how much has changed and how much of an impact that's had on so many people. Yeah. Totally. And I think absolutely, it's when charities have that focus on the issue that's really a priority for them, they have so much potential impact.
Totally. Yeah, and I think to briefly pick up on a piece you mentioned earlier, I think that nonprofits and charities don't necessarily have to be the most radical ones in the room. I think funders can be strategic by also funding and supporting social movements, which can form sort of like the outside flank of the advocacy sphere. And those groups, like the nonprofit, can work cannot be directly partnered, but can benefit from the political window of possibility being shifted and being pulled by those folks who are out further than them. We need look no further than the conversation happening in the US around trans rights or lack thereof to understand how this can work. At the CPAC conference, somebody getting up on stage and saying transgenderism should be eradicated. That is absolutely the far flank of the conservative sphere. And politicians can, use that to come in and seem more moderate by just saying, oh, we should just restrict, hormone access for kids, as though that's a moderate perspective, and those same, I think that's a very scary version of what that can look like. There's also the very bright version of what that can look like. We think about maybe the Black Lives Matter protests calling for the abolition of funding for police. There are other nonprofits that can benefit from those sort of bolder statements to call for something more moderate to ultimately shift things slightly. So I think these are all like tactics and judgment calls that can be made. And it would, I think there are a lot of issues that nonprofits would get a hell of a lot more change on were there to be more engagement in this sphere.
Absolutely. And I think that we're starting to wrap up a little bit in terms of how much time we have here, but we're having a great conversation. I mean, I'm okay to go on for a couple more minutes, but I think that, for me, the takeaway is that I think that I want people to go away with is, okay, there have been some specific instances, and I think it's important. One of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation today is I think it's really important to scrutinize when there's these things are happening behind closed doors, or at least that's the perception, right? Because people aren't always reading the details of their funding agreements as much as they should, and the public doesn't always have access to those agreements. So I think it's really important to highlight these issues. At the same time, I think it's also really important to reinforce that the role that the sector plays in advocacy is absolutely critical. And so, yes, it takes different forms. And I think to your point, you're right. There's tactics you can see from all ends of the political spectrum, and there's some organizations that maybe have, because of the way that they're funded or the way that they're structured, feel that like they are able to take more risks. But that's not to say that everyone doesn't have a role to play. And I think also the idea about collaborating as well with across sectors on issues of common concern, I think is also a really valuable way to approach these kinds of discussions.
Entirely. Yeah, couldn't agree more.
I guess we better wrap up.
Yeah, there's like a amazing multi-pronged question that just came in there, but I don't know, Jesse. I see we're at 33 minutes.
Yeah, so I'll pick up a couple of last comments. So just to pick up again here, I see that Kate Cornell had commented again in terms of the sector being too risk averse. Yeah, and I think that's something that to me, it really is reinforced by the scarcity mentality that's so prevalent in the nonprofit sector. And I've worked in nonprofits for more than 10 years. I know that it's not just a perception; it can be a reality, the scarcity, right? But I think that it's unfortunate because it has kind of this mutually reinforcing impact where, well, we don't have enough and we're scared to make a big splash. Yes, and then, there's 21 questions.
It looks like this is somebody posting a resource, 21 questions.
It looks like a really interesting list of questions. And I don't see, for some reason, whatever the way that this is showing us, and I'm not seeing who's making the comment, but I saw a similar post from someone earlier today, and I think it's a great set of questions to ask yourself as an organization. So definitely take a look at that as well. And it's a good reference point, the starting point for having these conversations inside your nonprofit or charity.
Awesome. Thanks, Jesse, so much thanks for having me. This has been a really lovely conversation, and excited to continue it in other spots.
Yeah, likewise, Gabe. Thank you so much for taking the time and for your coverage as well. I really appreciate the ongoing work that you're doing. It's really important for the sector, and great that we can have these kinds of conversations. If you're interested in these discussions, follow both of us and stick with us. I know that this is obviously an issue that we talk about a lot in my work, individual work with clients, as well as in courses and workshops that we offer as well. where we invite organizations to come and learn more broadly about how to work with these issues and wrestle with these issues. So please connect and join, and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you very much, everyone. And thanks so much, Gabe. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.